Welcome back to Brigham Young University Hawaii's online economics course. Today we're talking about Chapter 3, Demand and Supply. So let's go ahead and get started. Demand and supply are all based upon one very important concept which is fairly central to capitalist economies around the world. It's the idea of markets. Now, markets are institutions that bring buyers and sellers together. That's all they are. Historically, most communities had what's called a high street or a market street. That was the central location inside the community. And so if you created ironworks, you were the ironmonger, or you grew crops and you were bringing your fruits and vegetables to the market, you all came together at the local high street or the local market street, and you had your little booths or your little tents, and you sold your products. That was a market. Today, markets are fairly different. We still have farmers markets and we still have high streets, but typically they're full of stores, and we go there to exchange our money for the goods that we want. Markets are just institutions, locations, that bring together buyers and sellers. You may know them as farmers markets. eBay is a market. Amazon.com is a market. Nordstrom is a market. Your local automobile retailer is a market. All of these are markets because they bring together buyers and sellers. Let's talk about demand. For the learning objectives for this section of the chapter, we're going to try and define the quantity demanded for a good or service and illustrate using a demand schedule, which is nothing more than a table, and a demand curve. Number two, we're going to distinguish between the following pairs of concepts. Demand, which is a shift of a curve, quantity demanded, which is movement along a line, demand schedule and a demand curve, movement along and a shift in the demand curve. Number three, we're going to identify demand shifters, things that move curves, and determine whether a change in demand shift causes the demand curve to move right or left, and what that means. Okay. Quantity demanded is the quantity that buyers are willing to and able to buy of a good or service at a particular price during a particular period, everything else held constant. A demand schedule is nothing more than a table. It's a table that shows the quantities of a good or service demanded at different prices during a particular period, everything else held constant. A demand curve is nothing more than a graphical representation of a demand schedule or a demand table. Okay, change in quantity demanded is a movement along the demand curve that results from a change in price. So if we change the price of a good, we follow the law of demand, which means if price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. But if we're changing the price of the good on the graph, all we do is move along the curve. If we change anything other than the price, the curves are going to shift. Say that one more time. If we change the price of the good on the graph, we're going to be moving along the curve. If we change anything else other than the price, the curve is going to shift. The law of demand simply states that for virtually all goods and services, a higher price leads to a reduction in quantity demanded, and a lower price leads to an increase in quantity demanded. This is obvious and probably intuitive, but if the sandwiches at the Seasider were to double in price, we would demand less of them. If the sandwiches in the Seasider were to drop in price by half, we would desire more of them. And that's simply the law of demand. Let's talk about a demand schedule and a demand curve. This is an example of a demand curve. Demand curve is just a line that reflects the relationship of the law of demand. A demand schedule is just a table. So in this curve, what we see is that 25 million pounds of coffee per month are demanded at a price of about $56 per pound. Okay? Here's $56 a pound. You draw it over to your line. You drop it to the bottom, and that says 25 million pounds. Okay? 30 million pounds, which is here, will be demanded per month if we have a price of about $5 per pound. This is the demand schedule. The schedule is a table. The graph, which we have here, was nothing more than the plot of each one of these individual prices and each one of these individual quantities that are demanded. So we look here at $4, go to $4. What does it do? It goes to about 35 million pounds of coffee. Now, inasmuch as you're all good Mormons and you don't drink coffee, this is just an illustrative example of a product that we can understand not by our own consumption, but by looking at the markets. At $9 per pound, how much coffee are we going to demand? Well, just take $9 per pound, draw it over to the line. We're going to demand 10 million pounds. That's how you quantify, and that's how you graph a demand schedule. You put in all the points, all from the demand schedule, and you create the demand graph, or demand line. Okay, a change in demand is characterized by a shift in the demand curve. Remember, I didn't say a change in price, because if you go back to the previous graph, as I changed price all along here, what did I do? I just moved along the curve. So a change of the price of the good on the graph, which in this case is coffee, causes me to move along the demand curve. If I change anything else other than price, the whole curve is going to shift. And we're going to talk about that now. Okay, so a change in demand, not quantity demanded, but a change in demand is characterized by a demand curve shift. A demand shifter is a variable that can be changed and that can change the quantity of the good or service demanded at every price, not just at a single price. So think about that. Preferences, prices of related goods and services, those are complements and substitutes, income, demographic characteristics, and buyer expectations. All of these things cause a change in demand, which causes the demand curve to shift either right or to the left. Here's an interesting example. Here we have our price per pound in our millions of pounds per month. Here we have point A, which gives you the example of $6 per pound and demand of 25 million pounds. So here you see $6 per pound. Go over to the demand curve, draw it down. That gives you 25 million pounds. Okay? This was our old demand curve. Makes sense. But what we're going to do is now we're going to shift this demand curve by changing something that is non-price related. For example, consider income. Our income goes up. If our income rises, we are likely to demand more of almost every product that we've been purchasing. So in this occasion, we have D1, which is our previous demand curve. Now our demand curve is going to shift because we're now going to double our income. You left college, you got a real job, your income doubles. You're going to double or increase the amount of this good that you're purchasing. Your demand is going to shift to the right. Now under the new demand schedule, at $6, you demand 35 million pounds of this product. You can also have a reduction in demand, and sometimes for the same reasons. In this case, we had our previous position of $6 and 25 million pounds, this point A on demand curve 1. Now we're going to lose our jobs. Now we no longer make as much as we did before. We're now taking a part-time job with the PCC. And what happens? Our demand curve shifts from this D1 to a new demand curve. Our income goes down, causing the whole demand curve to shift from D1 to D2. Okay, now at that same $6 price, we're going to have demand for 15 million pounds. This is fairly typical of what happens during a recession. During a recession, people lose their jobs. Incomes go down. As incomes go down, demand for products and services also goes down. And our demand curve shifts to the left. Notice in this example and the previous example, I didn't say anything about changing the price of the particular good or service. All I said was incomes changed. And so consequently, we have a shift in the demand curve, not a movement along the curve. If we would have changed the price of the good on the graph, we would have stayed on the original demand curve and shifted it. So the two events that we need to make sure we understand and keep separate are, number one, changing of the price of the good of the graph. So if I change the price of the good on the graph, all I'm doing is moving up and down the demand curve. If I change any other event, like income, preferences, then I'm going to shift the curves. We'll talk about some of those specific events right now. Now let's talk about complements and substitutes. A complement is something that you buy together with another product. For example, in my life, I love toast. And because I love toast, I buy butter. I also buy jam, because butter and jam together with toast are awesome. They're complements. Substitutes are different. Substitute would be butter and margarine, because I don't buy them together and I don't put them on my toast together. So they're substitutes. And how complements and substitutes interact with one another is important. So let's talk about coffee and donuts. Are they complements or are they substitutes? Probably most people buy them together. So I would say they're complements. Coffee and donuts. So if I reduce the price of one, it increases the demand for another one. Let's walk through this. If I reduce the price of coffee, then I can buy more coffee and donuts. So it's going to increase the demand for donuts. Also, if I increase the price of one, I increase the price of coffee. If I buy my coffee and donuts together, now I have less money for donuts. So increasing the price of coffee reduces the price or reduces the demand for donuts. So let's talk about substitutes. Increasing the price of one, coffee and tea, causes an increase in the price for the other one. Now think through that. If these are substitutes, I don't drink coffee and tea, I drink coffee or tea. So if I increase the price of coffee, I'm going to end up increasing the demand for tea. Why? Because I'm not going to buy more coffee. I increase the price of coffee, I know that the law of demand says I'm going to decrease the demand for coffee. So what am I going to do? I'm going to increase the demand for tea. Because remember, substitutes are one or the other. So I increase the price of coffee. It causes me to increase the demand for tea. Alternatively, if I reduce the price of coffee, then coffee becomes more attractive relative to tea, and I'm going to reduce the demand for tea. That's how complements and substitutes work. All right, let's talk about price changes versus changes in demand. And I've hit this a few times already, so hopefully it makes some sense. This is our demand curve. Okay, a change in the price causes just a movement along the demand curve. So anytime I change the price of the good on the graph, in this case it could be coffee, it could be tea, it could be hot chocolate. Anytime I change the price of the good on the graph, I'm just going to move up and down this demand curve. Anytime I change the price of anything else, I'm going to shift it, either to the right or to the left. Now, if I shift to the right, that should indicate an expansion of the market, or of the market for the product. If I shift to the left, that's going to indicate a contraction or a shrinking of the market, or the market for the product. Okay? This is very important. Now we're going to move to supply. But before we do that, I'm going to make a caveat. And that is, whenever you think about demand, think about it from the perspective of being a consumer. Whenever you think about supply, think about supply from the perspective of being a producer. So whenever I look at a demand curve, I'm going to say, how would I behave as a consumer? Whenever I look at a supply curve, I'm going to think about it from the perspective of, how would I behave if I owned this company and I was producing this product? If you do that, this should all make sense. So the learning objectives for this section are, we need to define the quantity supplied of a good or service and illustrate it using the supply schedule, which is the table, and the supply curve, which is our drawing of the data points in the table. Number 2, we need to distinguish between the following pairs of concepts: supply and quantity supplied, supply schedule and supply curve, movement along and shift of a supply curve. The last one is, we're going to identify supply shifters and determine whether a change in supply shifts or whether we just move along the curve. Okay? Now this section is going to go a lot faster because we covered a lot of the basic ideas under the law of demand. So let's talk about the supply curve. The quantity supplied is the quantity sellers, remember we're thinking about this from the perspective of being a business owner, sellers are willing to sell of a good or service at a particular price during a particular period. All other things unchanged. A supply schedule is nothing more than a table that shows this relationship between quantities supplied at different prices during a particular period, everything else held constant. A supply curve is nothing more than the graphical representation of what we had in the supply schedule. Change in quantity supplied is characterized by movement along the supply curve by a change in price. All right, let's take a look. This is a supply curve. What you'll notice is that it is upward sloping to the right. Very different from the demand curve, which was downward sloping to the right. We'll put these two together here in just a minute. But here's our supply curve. What does it say? Well, it says something different than demand did. And the reason why is, let's just talk about this first point. We say 25 million pounds of coffee per month are supplied at a price of $6 per pound. Okay, so it's $6 per pound. We take it over, we draw this line over to the supply curve and drop it down. We're going to demand, or we're going to supply 25 million pounds of coffee. At a different point, $7, we're going to want to supply more. Now remember, the law of demand said, as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. Now we're going to see a different relationship. Whereas price goes up, quantity supplied also goes up. So this is a positive relationship resulting in a curve that is increasing upward to the right. Okay? So for supply, as price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. Now let's think through that intuitively, because it does make sense. If you own a business and you're producing coffee, if the price of coffee goes up, will you produce more? Well, if the price goes up, your profits go up. If your profits go up, you're certainly going to want to make more, because that'll allow you to accumulate more and more profits. So the law of supply really does make sense. As price goes up, the quantity supplied also goes up. This is an example of the supply schedule, which is nothing more than the data points of, at $4, we're going to supply 15 million pounds, at $5, 20, 6.25, and we just take each one of those data points and we graph them out. All right, so let's talk about changes in supply. Now remember, a change in supply is characterized by a shift of the supply curve. If I had said a change in the quantity supplied, you would know that that's a movement along the supply curve as a response to a change in price. But now I'm talking about a change in supply, and that's characterized by a shift of the supply curve. A supply shifter is some variable other than price that allows the quantity of a good or service supplied at each price to move. Some of those things include prices or factors of production, returns from alternative activities, technology. Now remember, in this technology section, we talk about technology as being the fundamental knowledge and capability we have to produce a product. Seller expectations, natural events, the number of sellers. All of these things are variables which cause the supply curve to shift. So here's an increase in supply. So we started out at point A, and at point A, at $6 per pound, we were willing to supply 25 million pounds. Now our supply curve has shifted. So we've gone from here to this new level. So now at $6, we're willing to supply 35 million pounds of coffee. Well, what would cause that shift to occur? Well, maybe as an example, we had increased rains, and all of a sudden our cost of producing a pound of coffee has dropped dramatically. So the cost of one of our factors of production has fallen. In this case, rain has caused increase in the harvest, so we have a decrease in the average cost per pound of coffee. That decrease has increased our profits, caused our supply curve to shift to the right. Now we could have the opposite occur. We could have the government step in and say, you know what, we're going to charge a tax on coffee because it makes a lot of really crazy, wild people, and these people are getting in automobile accidents. And what we have found statistically is after you've gone to the Starbucks, you've gotten your coffee, you get really hyper, you get sort of agitated, and you go out and find that you're in more accidents than you would otherwise be. So because of that, the government is going to say, we are going to charge a tax on every cup of coffee. So here you were at this demand schedule, where at $6 per pound of coffee, you were willing to supply 25 million pounds. Now the government's going to impose a tax. And the imposition of this tax is exactly the same as increasing your costs. So since your costs are increasing, your profits are going down, and so your supply curve, the amount you're willing to supply at any given price, is going to shift to the left. Okay? Remember, we didn't change the price of the good on the graph. These things, all we did was we changed other variables which caused the supply curve to shift. Remember also that if we were to shift the supply curve to the right, same as demand, we're expanding the market. If we were to shift the supply curve to the left, same as demand, we're contracting the market. Okay, let's talk about price changes versus changes in supply. The same way as we did this with demand, here's our supply curve. If we were to change the price of the good on the graph, it's just going to cause us to move along the supply curve. However, any variable that we change other than price is going to cause our supply curve to shift either to the right or to the left. An increase in supply causes an expansion of the market and causes us to shift our supply curve to the right. A decrease in supply causing a contraction in the market is going to cause us to shift the supply curve to the left. Now we're going to put these two together. The learning objectives of this section are: 1, to use demand and supply to explain how equilibrium price and quantity are determined in a market. Number 2, to understand the concepts of surpluses and shortages and the pressures on price that they generate. Number 3, to explain the impact of a change in demand or supply on equilibrium price and quantity. And number 4, to explain how the circular flow model provides an overview of demand and supply in product and factor markets, and how the model suggests ways that these markets are linked. So let's move forward. Let's put them together. There's this thing called the equilibrium price, often called the market clearing price. And it's the price at which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Now we could see that on a table when those two numbers are equal to each other, or we could also see it on a graph where the two graphs cross one another. The equilibrium quantity is the quantity demanded and supplied at the equilibrium price. A surplus is the amount by which the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded at a current price. And there could be a shortage, and a shortage is the amount by which the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied at a current price. So let's take a look. This is an example of an equilibrium price and quantity. We took our demand curve, we took our supply curve, and where they crossed here, we draw the line over to price, $6, and we draw our line down to quantity, which is 25 million pounds. So at $6, we're willing to demand 25 million pounds, and suppliers are willing to supply 25 million pounds. Where those two things are equal is called our market equilibrium, or market clearing price and quantity. If you had a situation where prices were higher, well, at a higher price than our market clearing price, we have a situation where the suppliers want to provide more, but people don't want to pay more. So suppliers are here saying, at this higher price per pound, we're wanting to supply 35 million pounds. But at that higher price per pound, consumers want to only consume 15 million pounds. So what do you have? You have a situation where you have more supply than you have demand, so you have a surplus. So the situation where anytime your price is above the market clearing price of $6, say it goes to $8, at $8 we just draw our line over here to demand and we drop it down. At $8 we're going to demand 15 million pounds of coffee. At $8 suppliers want to supply 35 million pounds of coffee, and so we're going to have a surplus. Suppliers are going to supply 35 million. Consumers are going to only buy 15 million. There's more product in the market than there is demand for the product, and we have a surplus. Okay? We can also have a shortage. A shortage is a situation where at a price lower than the equilibrium, remember equilibrium was at 6, and that was the market clearing price. At a price lower, say $4, we draw our line over here to demand. At $4, we're going to, supply, draw our line over here to the supply curve. At $4, we're going to supply only 15 million pounds of coffee. But at $4, where's our demand? We draw it over here to the demand curve. At $4, we want 35 million. So since the quantity that we want is greater than the quantity that is supplied, we have an excess of demand over supply, and we have a shortage. That's our shortage at $4 per pound. Okay, so let's talk about shifts. Shifts of the demand and of the supply curve. We talked about what kind of things shift these curves. Now we're going to talk about what are the effects of the shifts. So we talked about this shift from D1. So we moved from our demand curve 1 to demand curve 2. And that may have been caused by an increase in income. So an increase in income caused our demand curve to shift from D1 to D2. Well, let's talk about what that did. We now have our supply curve in there. We now have a new equilibrium. We had an equilibrium of $6 and 25 million pounds of coffee. Now, because our income has increased, our demand curve has shifted from D1 to D2. We now have a new equilibrium, and the new equilibrium has a price of $7 and a quantity of 30 million pounds. Okay, so we changed our market clearing price, we changed our equilibrium, and it resulted in higher prices and higher quantities. Now, what if we had shifted our demand curve the other direction? What if our incomes had gone down? If our incomes had gone down from D1 to D2, the demand curve would have shifted to the left. We would have contracted the market, and we would have changed our equilibrium. Our equilibrium would have moved from D1 to this new equilibrium demand curve, and our prices would have gone down from $6 and 25 million pounds to $5 and 20 million pounds. So when you include the demand and the supply curve and you develop this concept of equilibrium price and quantity, as these curves shift, you have a resulting change in price and quantity. And for the exam and for your assignments, you're just going to need to be able to understand how those things work. The same thing works for a shift in supply. Shift in supply could take us from our previous equilibrium position of this supply curve and this demand curve, and here's our equilibrium at $6.25 million. Now we have a shift in the supply curve to the right. Now this could have been the example we used of an increase in rains, which causes our average cost of a pound of coffee to drop dramatically. If our costs go down, we as suppliers are going to provide more of the product, causing our supply curve to shift from here to here. As our supply curve shifts, what happens to our equilibrium? Well, this was our previous equilibrium point at $6.25 million. Now our supply curve has shifted, the market has expanded, but as the supply has shifted, we now have a new equilibrium of $5.30 million. Now the same example can be used to shift the curve to the left. We use the example of increased taxes. So if the government imposes taxes on our coffee, now the relative cost of producing a pound of coffee is increased because of the taxes, and so our supply curve is going to shift to the left. And what does that do to equilibrium price and quantity? Well, this was our equilibrium at $6.25 million pounds of coffee. Now our supply curve is going to shift here to the left. We have a new equilibrium at now $7.20 million pounds of coffee. So the equilibrium price has increased and the equilibrium quantity has decreased. Now sometimes you're going to get both of these curves to shift. So if you get a simultaneous shift of the curves, in this case what you had is a decrease in demand and supply. So supply curve shifts to the left, demand curve shifts to the left, and what you have is a shift in both supply and demand, and you have a resulting drop in your price and drop in your quantity demanded. Now here you have another shift, and you have a drop in your demand curve, and you have a drop in your supply curve. And what do you have? You have a resulting move from equilibrium from here to here, which causes your price to rise and your quantity to drop. Now what you should see, and what you will see in all of these cases, is that sometimes you can understand that yes, price will change and quantity will change. Sometimes it's a little bit unsure. This is an example of a case being unsure where our demand curve shifts to the left, our supply curve also shifts to the left, and what we know is that absolutely we got a drop in quantity from 25 million to 15 million, but because of the distance that both of these curves shifted, we didn't get at all a change in price. So the change in price was indeterminate. Clearly we understand that the price or the quantity change from 25 to 15 was significant. So sometimes you can tell where your price is moving and your quantity is moving, and sometimes it's a little bit less clear. This gives us some interesting examples. So take a few minutes to learn this table and to see where the curves individually move and how they affect both price changes and quantity changes. The question marks in the table show that we really can't be sure. It depends upon how much they move. The ones that are in green are certain, and the question marks relatively uncertain. Now we're going to close this section by talking about the circular flow model. Be sure to read the book about this. It's fairly clear, but it's something that's fairly important for you to understand. The circular flow model is just a model that provides a look at how markets work and how they are related to one another. Product markets are markets in which firms supply goods and services demanded by individual households. Factor markets are markets in which households supply factors of production, labor, capital, land, natural resources demanded by firms. So you can see that the product markets are providing products to households. Households then provide labor, capital, and natural resources so that the product markets, the companies, can produce the individual products. There's a dramatic relationship between each of these markets, and that can be depicted in a circular flow diagram or circular flow model. And here it is. Firms provide products and services. Households take those products and services and use them. They spend their money by giving the money to the firms for those products and services. But households also provide things for the product markets. They provide labor. They provide use of equipment. They provide natural resources. Those natural resources then are used to provide the resources necessary for products, necessary for the firms to make products. And that's the circular flow diagram. So make sure you can understand this and you can draw it out. It'll be useful for one of your exams in the future. That's the end of this section. In the next discussion, we're going to talk about some extensions or applications to the laws of supply and demand. Thank you, and we'll see you then.